Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's exciting installment of our Lunch Bites series. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship here at the United States Capitol Historical Society. We're so glad that so many of you have taken time out of your day to join us for what promises to be a lively discussion about America's favorite Senate procedure. Before we get started with today's content program here, I'd like to do a little bit of technical housekeeping about how we like to use this webinar platform to engage with you, our audience. If you have any questions for Dr. Binder or Mr. Hawkings over the course of today's program, you can submit those into the Q&A section of the webinar. It looks like two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on which device you're using to join us, what type of device you're using to join us today. Jane will be keeping an eye on the Q&A section and will pose those questions to Sarah and David as we proceed. If you have any technical troubleshooting matters, if you feel like you're having difficulty seeing us or hearing us during the course of today's program, or have general inquiries not for our speakers, you can pose those in the chat section of the webinar. I will be keeping an eye on that area, and I will be keeping an eye on the chat section, and we'll answer those in real time. So once again, any content-based questions for our speakers can go into the Q&A. Any technical matters can go into the chat. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, to introduce today's speakers. Jane?
Good afternoon. It is good to see you all, and we're honored to have you here with us today as we explore something that has been talked about, and we're here to get to the bottom of what is really the situation with the legislative filibuster. We are so honored today to have two distinguished panelists. Sarah Binder is a professor of political science at George Washington University and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Her specialty is Congress and legislative politics. She is most recently the co-author with Mark Spindle of The Myth of Independence: How Congress Governs the Federal Reserve, which was awarded prizes for the best book on legislative politics in 2017, and has also been the author of books including Minority Rights, Majority Rule, Partisanship in the Development of Congress with Stephen Smith, and a book on filibustering. So we have the renowned expert in the filibuster. Dr. Binder received her BA from Yale University in 1986 and her PhD in political science from the University of Minnesota in 1995. And she will be joined today, as is our tradition, where we often have a scholar and a practitioner, with a practitioner who is been a practicing journalist in that area. David Hawkings is the founding editor of the Fulcrum. Some of you will remember David has been a regular commentator of ours to try to explain legislative procedure, including giving us the lay of the land on the budget reconciliation, if you want to look back at that video when that conversation comes up. David was most recently the senior editor of CQ Roll Call and wrote columns for each publication, hosting the Roll Call Decoder series of videos and podcasters. And he has become a real expert in translating Congress speak into English so that the rest of us can understand it. And in his time, the magazine won 2 Dirksen Awards for the coverage of Congress. And so we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Sarah Binder and Mr. David Hawkings. As we start the conversation, Professor Binder will lead us off in what is the history of the filibuster? Where did it come from and what does it mean? And when she finishes her presentation, she will kick it off to David Hawkings to talk about how it looked from a journalist's perspective as things were moving through the Congress, or maybe not moving. So take it away, Sarah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for including me today. I'm just going to take 1 second to share my screen so we can see slides and make sure we're up and running here. Okay, are we good? Can you all see slides, I assume?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, perfect. Well, so thank you so much. I first started investigating the origins and the evolution of the filibuster some 25 years ago, writing a book with my political science colleague, Stephen Smith, then at the University of Minnesota. And we discovered pretty quickly that no feature of legislative procedure had received more attention but less scrutiny than the Senate filibuster. It was certainly the only congressional rule that had been the focus of a Hollywood film, of course, starring no less than Jimmy Stewart. Now, of course, when I put this up for my 20-year-old students, I have to explain to them who Jimmy Stewart was, but I think we're hopefully in good company, today. So before I dig into the history, I want to share with you what I think of as our three sort of overarching conclusions from our historical dig, and then we can go into the details of the history. So first, filibusters are an age-old problem for the Senate. Majorities for almost 2 centuries have struggled with minority obstruction, sometimes partisan minorities, other times sectional minorities. Second, all the way back to the mid-19th century, leading senators have sought reforms to rein in the filibuster. And the Senate, of course, is still struggling to find an acceptable balance between minority rights and majority rule. And of course, the unfortunate passing yesterday of Fritz Mondale, former vice president, and of course, longtime senator from Minnesota. He was instrumental in those efforts to try to reform the filibuster in the mid to late 20th century. Third, senators from both political parties have at times voted to curtail the rights of the minority. True, their record is not overwhelming, but the broad pattern is clear. The long arc of Senate history is bending slowly, sometimes more quickly in the recent past decade, but slowly towards majority rule, even if that path is a bit rocky and uneven and still ongoing. So now that you know where I'm headed, we can dig deeper into here the historical path that gets us there. So I want to organize my comments today around what we might think of as 3 myths about the Senate filibuster. First, that the filibuster was an original feature, an intended feature of the Senate. Second, myth that the 19th century really was a golden age of deliberation. And third, that Senate majorities have consistently preferred minority rule as an explanation why today we still have what we might think of as the quote unquote legislative filibuster. So to the first myth, Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution has what we call the rulemaking clause, that the House and Senate shall each write their own rules. Now, if you take a look at the House and Senate rules today, and you look at the House rule in particular, there is a rule that we call the previous question motion. And it's got a great use for majorities today because it allows a simple majority to cut off debate on an amendment, on a motion, on a measure, you name it. It's not debatable. You offer it. If a majority is ready to vote, it ends debate, and whatever you're debating comes up for an up or down vote. In the Senate, of course, if you look at the rule book, there is no previous question motion. They have a clunky cloture rule that we'll come to, but aside from nominations, it requires a supermajority vote. As it turns out, in 1789, when the House and Senate eventually make it to Philadelphia to write their own rules in their first rule books, both chambers' rule books included what looked like a previous question motion. It was called a previous question motion. As it turns out, it did not have that effect of cutting off debate. And the weird thing, certainly on the Senate side, is that on the handful of times in the early years when senators used the previous question motion, it often had the reverse effect of allowing debate to continue, which is just sort of topsy-turvy. But the bottom line is that senators soon were basically called to task. And they were called to task by none other than Aaron Burr. Now, before Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton, the musical. I had to tell my students who Aaron Burr was, but now they all, everybody knows. So what's Aaron Burr's role here? It's 1805. He has recently murdered the previous year, Alexander Hamilton, high noon at the Hudson, as it were. And he is still the vice president, and he's dispensing advice, as vice presidents do, to the Senate. And one of the things he does in this farewell speech to the Senate before he has to get out of town is to comment on their rule book. Now, you might wonder, how do we know what Aaron Burr told the Senate? Because there was no verbatim. We didn't have the congressional record. We had the annals, which were sort of a little loosey-goosey reflections of what was said on the floor. Lucky for us, we also have John Quincy Adams, who had a great memoir where he told us specifically what was said on the floor. And it turns out Burr in 1805 was noting, and this is Adams recollects it, he says, Burr mentioned one or two rules which appeared to him to need a revisal, including the abolition regarding the previous question motion. And it turns out, as Adams continues reflecting Burr, Burr notes you don't really use it and it has the effect of keeping debate going, so just drop it from the rule book. And sure enough, in 1806, they codify, clean up the rules, and it's gone. There's no more previous question motion. Now, no one thinks anything of it, but over in the House in 1811, in the heat up and the build up to what we now call the War of 1812, the majority is looking for a way to cut off debate. They see the previous question motion in the rule book. They overturn a ruling of the speaker, what we now would call the nuclear option, and they revise the previous question motion. It is now on its way to becoming a tool for cutting off debate. It takes decades of reform to get it in really good shape, that rule, but the House is off and running towards majority rule. The Senate, it's 1820s, it's 1830s, we get Whigs, we get Democrats, we get partisanship, we get slavery, the admission of states to the Union, and suddenly senators are talking all night, and leaders look to the rule book and do not have that easy way to cut off debate. No previous question motion. Now, why is it not there? Why did they get rid of the previous question motion? Was it because they thought, gee, we wanted a deliberative chamber where the minority gets to talk all night because we value minority rights? No, it's there. I think it's okay to call it a mistake. It is at least the existence of the filibuster is at least the unintended or unanticipated consequence of a procedural cleanup to the rule book. Now, fine, we get into the 19th century, the second myth, that is this great and glorious system of extended and deliberative, the golden age of debate. Well, it was not so golden. This is simply from our filibuster book. It tags the number of what we think of from historians and our own counts of filibusters, which we can come to later of why they're difficult to count. But what you can see here, the black line are civil rights and slavery related, the dotted line are non-civil rights. What do we mean by non-civil rights? Who should be the printer? They filibustered that. What do we do about censoring Andrew Jackson? And can we undo it? There was a filibuster about that. Appropriations bills, you name it, there was a filibuster, and many of them were quite partisan, even though obviously there were very heated ones over slavery. The bottom line here in this period was the filibuster was not reserved for the great issues of the day. In fact, one historian in writing in the early 20th century called it filibustering unconstrained in this late 19th century period. So it was filibusters over everything. And of course, it was weaponized by the Southern segregationists, and John C. Calhoun in particular, trying to turn it into a tool to protect slavery in the South. Now, at the same time, myth number 3, we think, well, maybe we kept the filibuster because everybody liked it that way. But what we learned pretty quickly is that the great leaders of the day, the great Senate leaders of the day, in fact, many of them wanted to curtail the filibuster. In particular, Henry Clay, who in 1841 introduced a motion to reinstate the previous question motion. What do you think happened? Well, in then and subsequent efforts, they were all filibustered. The motion to ban the filibuster was filibustered. Now, just out of curiosity here, you may be wondering about the great triumvirate. We've got Clay, who favored changing the rules to limit debate. We do have Webster, who was a little quieter on what he thought. And then, of course, John C. Calhoun. We know he loved the filibuster. But one quick thing on John C. Calhoun, When he was in the House in 1811, he voted to weaponize the previous question motion into a tool of debate. Where you stand depends on where you sit. So we have episodes to reform the filibuster in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And until 1917, they largely fail. Typically, the minority filibustered them and the majority gave up, right? It wasn't worth their time to sacrifice the rest of their agenda to leave the Senate tied in knots. So we need to be careful in thinking that majorities wanted the Senate this way just because supermajority rules tended to last so long. Quickly, 1917, we do finally get what we call now and then the Cloture Rule, Rule 22. That's Robert La Follette, who was part of a band of what was then called 11 willful men, he was fighting a measure to arm merchant ships in the run-up to World War I. They end up in a rather large national battle with Woodrow Wilson, who's on the side, obviously, of the Democrats, trying to create a cloture rule to cut off debate. We get the Cloture Rule in 1917. It's a 2/3 rule, 2/3 of those present and voting. Why 2/3? Well, Democrats, most of them wanted majority cloture. Republicans in the minority wanted 3/4 cloture. 2/3 was bare-fisted politics. That's where the compromise came out. Not because the vast majority appreciated supermajority rights, supermajority rule, but because it was just the political outcome. It was compromise, ending up at 67 votes. Now, cloture's not used very often. It had a very high threshold. We get into what we are pretty famous, what we now call talking filibusters of the 20th century. That's Richard Russell from Georgia on the left in his PJs and housecoat during a filibuster, and Everett Dirksen on the right from Illinois, on opposite sides of civil rights, but here speaking with each other, probably early one evening overnight in the Senate. Now, what do we know? This is obviously a huge history here, but just to keep in mind what's happening, we have Southerners using the filibuster to fight civil rights measures, starting in the 1920s, anti-polling, poll tax, anti-lynching, civil rights measures. At the same time, in the 1950s, we have efforts by liberal Democrats to try to rein in the filibuster. We do get civil rights reforms in 57, civil rights bills in 64 and 65. And with that, when civil rights, for some degree, those issues are resolved, Democrats themselves, Northern Democrats and liberals, and then new Northern Republicans and conservatives get into the game of filibustering, right? It's no longer stigmatized as the tool of Southern segregationists. It becomes the tool for large portions of the Senate. At the same time, in the 60s, and again, largely in the 70s, with Mondale at the helm, pushing for reform of cloture, till 1975, it's lowered to 60 votes. Now, just to very briefly bring us up and wrap us up here, cloture was reduced to 60. At the same time, in the early 70s, the leaders create what we call tracking. It was just an agreement between the majority and the minority that they're going to create 2 tracks. If you were going to filibuster, we'd leave you on track 1, and the Senate would move on to track 2 to get stuff done. What did that mean? It meant that it became very easy to filibuster. And it meant that it became very easy for leaders just to use cloture, right? Instead of a war of attrition, right? Which team's going to be the last one standing? When it mattered who cared most intensely, leaders just could count votes. Did they have 60 when filing cloture? And as you can see here, cloture becomes a more and more attractive tool for majorities. Majorities would say it's because the minority was filibustering. Majority would say it's because that was the only way to run the chamber. But at the end, we get all the way to the contemporary period where cloture is rampant. And we can come back to nominations, but by and large, majorities are smaller today than they have been over the last decade. It gets harder and harder to get to 60. And with that, I hand it off to David, who will give us a reporter's on-the-ground perspective on these issues of filibusters and Senate and reform. And I will stop screen share. Great.
Thank you. You're not sharing your screen, so now I should share mine, which requires me to know how to remember how to do that. No, I didn't do it right, did I? Hello?
Not yet,
Hi.
David. Almost there.
Oh, share screen. Now what happens? Did I share my screen right?
No, not yet. If share screen should bring up a little window where you can select the screen you want to share.
Ah. Did I do it now?
It's starting now. There we go.
Okay, sorry guys, this is typical me. And my pictures are not nearly as illustrative as Sarah's. Okay, off we go. So Sarah's brought us up to where I think we more or less are now. If you've tuned in today, you probably know that since the Mondale change to reduce the threshold for invoking cloture, cutting off the filibuster from 67 to 60, there have been two more changes to the filibuster. One by the Democrats in 2013, which was to shield all nominations except for the Supreme Court from that supermajority requirement. And then by the Republicans, when they were in the majority in 2017, to allow justices of the Supreme Court to get confirmed with a simple majority as well. So now the filibuster exists only for legislation and not even for those legislation under those budget bills that we refer to as being able to move under reconciliation. That's a story for an earlier day. As Jane kindly mentioned, we did a session on that a month or so ago, this so-called reconciliation. So now the filibuster really only lives for legislation that is not one of the one or two budget bills a year that can move under that special process. So that's why it's in the news now. Obviously, Senate's 50-50. They have no hope really of moving the Biden agenda of any controversy without unclogging the so-called cloture pipeline. So to me, it seems like a good way to focus on this for at least a few minutes about what the situation is now is to go back to really one of the most interesting stories I ever covered, which was back when the so-called nuclear option was almost deployed. It came within hours of being deployed. The Senate almost went nuclear, was saved only by a significant block of centrists. There have been many gangs. We talk about a lot of gang behavior in Congress. This was the famous Gang of 14. Excuse me, back in 2005. It didn't happen. Why? Because the will to get things done significantly exceeded the type of will we have today, which is only to have partisan warfare to the death. If you believe that these two are the only two people who are alone really in that camp now, which is arguably the case, Kristen Sinema of Arizona, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, then there are just two of them really at the moment. And back then there were, as we discussed, 14. A reminder, why do they call it the nuclear option? So maybe it's pretty obvious, but worth a second to say, sort of, if a nuclear bomb is the ultimate piece of equipment in a military war, it's the last available option. It's the ultimate option. It is an invitation to mutually assured destruction. Then that seems like a pretty good metaphor to use to discuss its parliamentary equivalent, which has been called by its critics breaking the rules in order to change the rules. Essentially, Senate usually takes 2/3 majority to change Senate rules. This is a clever parliamentary way to do it with just a simple majority vote. I think I can do this in 3 sentences. Follow along. The way it's most easily accomplished is the majority leader makes a point of order that is the opposite of the standing rules of the Senate. That's part one. Then the presiding officer says, no, you've got that wrong. Your point of order is denied because of our existing Senate rules and precedents. And then the majority leader appeals that ruling, gets a majority of senators to vote with him, there's always been a him, and a new precedent is set by simple majority rule. Who coined the term nuclear option? It was our friend Trent Lott when he was the majority leader back in 2003. And back in 2003, this is George W. Bush's second half of his first term, and the Democrats did not like the slate of judicial nominees he was putting forward, and they started filibustering, as Sarah said, on this sort of track where there wasn't live filibusters. They just said, we oppose, we're going to filibuster a bunch of Bush judicial nominees. This is an excuse for a funnier slide. Lott called it the nuclear option. The other alternative was to call it the Hulk. This was the idea of Ted Stevens, famously pugilistic Senate pro tempore Republican of Alaska, who, for reasons lost to me, loved the Hulk, often wore that tie there, wore it on important days when he was feeling particularly combative. And he was really itching to be in the presiding officer's chair when this nuclear option or Hulk option went down. I don't think in the end he was, but I don't remember that part. Most of his other Republicans called it the constitutional option, which is the idea that the Constitution actually trumps Senate rules and says the Senate should have the power to govern itself by a simple majority. Anyway, this problem festered for 2 years. These 10 judicial nominees got hung up through the 2004 election. And when Bush won re-election in 2004, he put almost all of them back before the Senate, renominated most of them. And by this time, Trent Lott was no longer the majority leader. That he had famously made a, I think this euphemism is racially insensitive comments about Strom Thurmond at Strom Thurmond's 100th birthday party. He was undercut to remain majority leader by the Bush White House, who preferred Bill Frist instead. Bill Frist is Dr. Bill Frist of Tennessee on your left there. So Bill Frist was installed as majority leader instead of Lott. And Bill Frist immediately thought, well, this is great. Now I can move from majority leader to my real aspiration, which is to become president in 2008. So I'd better intensify the judicial wars. And he started talking nuclear option almost right away. It was not as easy as we think of it now. He had to persuade some of the institutionalists on his own side to go along, but by May of 2005, he felt that with Dick Cheney's help, there's Dick Cheney there on the far right, he could get it done. And he even sort of served notice as to a day. It was going to be May 24th, 2005. Cheney was going to come in. They were going to go nuclear. Harry Reid, for his own reasons, which were to shore up the bona fides on his side, essentially did nothing about this. Thought, well, I think we're going to let Harry Reid blow up the Senate. This will work for my progressive base. So we're just going to let this happen. And behind the scenes, however, there was a group of 14 members that started having a bunch of colloquies, informal meetings. They met in some hideaway offices, and they kept talking and talking and talking. And on the day before the appointed hour, they all gathered in John McCain's office in the Russell Building for a long negotiating session. And at the end of the night, or the end of the evening, it was sort of in the evening time, they came out and announced they had a deal, the Gang of 14. These 7 Democrats, their promise was that they would not join any judicial filibusters for the next 2 years, except in what was described in their written agreement, which they all signed, as except in extraordinary circumstances. But that language, what was an extraordinary circumstance, was left undefined. It was left to each senator to decide what an extraordinary circumstance was. Just to go over this roster for you, upper left-hand corner, Mary Landrieu of Louisiana. Next to her, Mark Pryor of Arkansas, then Joe Lieberman of Connecticut. In the upper right-hand corner, Ben Nelson of Nebraska. Lower row, Ken Salazar of Colorado, who apparently may be our next ambassador to Mexico. In the middle, Robert C. Byrd of West Virginia, and to his right, Dan Inouye of Hawaii. So Inouye and Byrd were sort of the institutionalists who were committed to they were more progressive, but they were institutionalists committed to saving the Senate from itself in this view, whereas the other 5 were centrists who, believed in compromise, believed in getting it done, believed crassly that this was their best way of getting reelected. Then the other 7 were these 7, and they made a different promise. It was all in one big document, but their promise was different, and it was enough to say that they would not vote to go nuclear. They would not vote with Frist to go nuclear for the next 2 years in return for what the 7 Democrats have promised. So just quickly, we have, of course, McCain in the upper left, Susan Collins and Lindsey Graham, the only 2 senators remaining from this entire group. Lincoln Chafee of Rhode Island in the upper right-hand corner, Mike DeWine, now the governor of Ohio, on the lower left, Olympia Snowe of Maine, John Warner of Virginia. Again, sort of Warner, sort of the institutionalist, tiny bit more conservative than the others back in the day. And the others sort of similarly thought that their best political interest and their reason for being in the Senate was to try and find the middle. So the math was simple. With this gang of 14, there were 2 more than enough votes to invoke cloture and move past a filibuster on any Bush nominee. And there were too few votes, just 48, to go nuclear. So the deadlock broke. A bunch of the Bush nominees that have been hanging around since before the election moved through. With all the support of all 14 of these, the real acid test came the next year when in these 2 nominations, Judge Samuel Alito, then of the Third Circuit, got put on the Supreme Court because all 14 gang members voted to end the debate, to end the filibuster. This was crucial because in the end, only 58 senators voted to put Alito on the Supreme Court. A couple of the people who voted to end the debate ended up voting against his confirmation. And then later that year, Brett Kavanaugh, who was then in the Bush White House legal staff, got put on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, in part because 5 of the gang's Democrats voted to stop the filibuster and allow his nomination to go forward. Not all 7. In a way, he voted against Kavanaugh all the way through, and Ken Salazar didn't vote, just so you know. And in the end, Byrd, Landrieu, and Nelson voted for his confirmation. So it was the gang of 14 started to shrink a tiny bit. And their relevance ended altogether the next year when the Democrats won the Senate and had the power to stop any Bush nominees on their own without even needing to use a filibuster because they were in control. DeWine and Chafee were they went down to defeat that year. That was one of the reasons that the Democrats took over. Things sort of cooled down for a little while. And through Barack Obama's first 2 years in office, after excuse me, by the time Barack Obama got reelected, Harry Reid's margin was down to just 51 votes. And the Republicans were opposed to lots of Obama nominees, and Reid started threatening to go nuclear right away. By this time, only 5 gang members were left: McCain and Graham and Collins on the Republican side, Pryor and Landrieu on the Democratic side. They got close to going nuclear that July. They had one more sort of kumbaya meeting in the old Senate chamber, that sort of the Senate chamber that was just down the hall from the current Senate chamber that was illustrated in Sarah's slide of the famous 3. They all met for sort of an airing of grievance. It cooled the tempers for just a couple of months, but by the fall, so many of Obama's nominees were held up, not just judicial nominees, but also executive branch nominees, that Reid went nuclear again. Yeah, I'm just looking at my notes here. At this time, there were 60 executive branch nominees and 14 judicial nominees awaiting confirmation. Sorry, 17 judicial nominees. Reed tried on 3 of them, got nowhere, and decided that it was time to pull the trigger. The vote was 52 to 48. And the only Republicans, all the Republicans voted against Reed, and they were joined actually by 3 Democrats. Manchin, who was then a senator, Mark Pryor, still left over from the gang of 14, and Carl Levin of Michigan. But the only other Democrat who was left from the gang in those days, Mary Landrieu, she voted with Harry Reid to go nuclear. There's a picture of Reid explaining what he was about to do. And then, and again, harkening back to what Sarah said about where you stand is where you sit. You had Mitch McConnell. This is screen grab from when he said sort of a famous quote, "You will regret this and you may regret it sooner than you think," McConnell said just before this vote. And it wasn't sooner than you think. It was 39 months later, to be exact, that McConnell, had a chance to get his revenge, take the filibuster, neutralizing or nuclearizing one step further by a purely party line vote this time in April 2017, right along party lines to end the ability to filibuster Supreme Court nominees. And this, of course, led to the idea here was to allow the confirmation of Gorsuch. Of course, Neil Gorsuch, who was nominated to fill the seat of Alito, to fill the seat of Antonin Scalia, who had died. A year before the election, McConnell held the seat open, didn't allow Merrick Garland, now our Attorney General, to go on the Supreme Court. So he went nuclear to get Gorsuch on the court, and then subsequent to that, he didn't need to go nuclear in order to get Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett on the court. So that is where we are now. That is why we called it the nuclear option. And I think Sarah and I are now going to play Let's Do Questions, and I will unshare my screen. There we go.
Well, I tell you, you two have done a great job of sort of laying out the scenario. I'll tell you one fun fact is, Sarah, you'll appreciate this, is that the society bought one of the desks that they used in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and donated it to the Senate, so they would have it for their festivities. We try to keep things fun. But when you look at this whole question, it seems to me, Sarah, from your laying it out, that the filibuster and the sort of supermajority requirement in the Senate was never part of the original plan for the Senate. It happened almost by accident. Is that accurate?
So I think there's a number of ways to think about that. First, if you look at what the framers were thinking about when they constructed and write the Constitution for the new Senate, they were very familiar with supermajority rules and how they affected the ability, in this case, it was of the Confederation Congress, that under the Articles of Confederation, there were almost all supermajority rules and some things requiring unanimity. And oftentimes delegates didn't show up and so forth. And so that was a stymied, gridlocked institution, if there ever was one. And there are lots of other reasons why it didn't look like the contemporary Congress. So those framers knew the impact of supermajority rules. They wrote about it in the Federalist Papers, bemoaning what it means when you empower numerical minorities. So I think it's fair to say that the framers were not looking to create a supermajority institution. And certainly if we look at how the Senate resolved debates over the 19th century, even when they had no cloture rule or any real rule that would allow them to cut off debate, eventually, if they could overcome filibusters, it moved by majority rule, right? Even very heated discussions. At the end of the day, either they'd run out of time and the filibusters won, or they back down. There'd be often a compromise or not, and the majorities would take what they could get, but it really was moving by majority rule. So I would agree that the idea that Senate lost that key rule really hampered their efforts to really become a more strong majority rule institution.
David, in your stories, have you seen, when you started covering Congress, was it the talking filibuster? When did they make that transition from the talking filibuster to the we just count the votes and call it a day?
Well, I think Sarah pointed to the actual time when she's talking about the two tracking. I mean, by the time I started covering Congress in the early 90s, it was definitely the tracking system. This is back in the days when there was something called the whip phone. This is before email. There was something called the whip phone. It was like some of them were actually red, some of them were black. It was a stupid phone with no dial tone that was placed on the legislative director's desk of every senator, and the majority leader would call around and say, here's what we're planning on doing next, and here are the other bills that I want to bring up. Call me back if you want to put a hold on it. And that was what it all took. I'm sure, Jane, this was when you were on the Hill. This was the system. So right. there weren't too many talking filibusters. You just basically had to use the whip phone to serve notice that you objected to this bill and would filibuster it if it came up, and that was all it took to put it on the back burner. Now, that having been said, there were dramatic speech making moments. There were some times when and even until recently, sometimes people do what we refer to colloquially as filibusters. They're actually not. There was a time when Ted Cruz a couple of years ago read green eggs and ham all night, and it was when he was trying to put a stop to Obamacare, as I recall. It wasn't really a filibuster because actually, in a parliamentary way, there was a way to stop him from talking. They already had a unanimous consent agreement to have a vote the next morning, so he was just basically filling the time until the next vote could happen. Senator Murphy, after Newtown and after some other gun mass shootings, has held the floor for long periods of time talking, but they're not really filibusters in a super technical sense because that's not the pending business. So those are the rare things. I can't really think of a time when somebody has given some super melodramatic speech that went on for a long time that was on the pending business. Bernie Sanders did once against an extension of the Bush tax cuts, as I recall, but they're very few and far between. It's now it's done by email. I object. It's not. Yeah, you're not going to get somebody's computer keyboard from any movie to give to the Senate for.
Now let's ask one of the questions we're hearing from our audience, and I remind the audience that you can send your questions in through the Q&A function, and we'll try to pose them to our distinguished panelists. And so, would either of you opine on why there were so many judicial vacancies when President Trump took office, even though Senator Reid had gone nuclear in order to move President Obama's nominees?
So I'll just briefly, the nuclear option majority rule helps if you are the majority, but Democrats lost the majority in 2014. And so with control of the agenda, Mitch McConnell as the new majority leader in 2015, he just didn't call up the nominations. And it's without a supermajority, it's really hard to get around the majority leader who doesn't want to go into executive session. And I think the numbers, the question is absolutely right. The numbers are something like 15% of the nominees were confirmed. And those were probably district court appointees from states with Republican senators who wanted to see those nominees confirmed.
Right. It was actually absolutely right that there was given that it was McConnell's had the thing under control. making these nominations and making these judges, I mean, once you're nominated, even if your nomination's not going anywhere, there's a whole lot of paperwork. There's a whole lot of, you have to change your finances. You have to change your whole behavior. If you're, why put these people through it if it was going to go nowhere?
Got it. So essentially what happened in the last 2 years of Obama's presidency is that his judicial nominations just didn't move because the Senate was not under
very few of them. I don't think
partisan
any to the circuit courts. I think some trial court judges did move, but they were, as Sarah said, it was only when there was, and district court judges don't have the kind of ideological clout that appellate court judges do. So sometimes it's a keeping the trains running on time function to make sure the criminal docket and the civil docket keep moving in these places, and everybody agree.
And here's a question that our listeners are posing, having heard the sort of history of the filibuster. There are many sort of accusations, if you will, in the current press that the filibuster in and of itself is a tool to work against racial equality. Would you like to opine on that matter?
Oh, so I'll take the historical part. It's certainly the case that Southern segregationists exploited the filibuster and lots of ways of trying to block majorities through the 19th century and effectively, right? And into the 20th century for sure. The caveat here is that Southern segregationists were not the only ones exploiting the filibuster and the Senate's lax limits on debate in the 19th century. There were plenty of partisan, as opposed to what we might think of as sectional filibusters, where both parties in the minority found the lax limits to their benefit. Over the long haul of Senate history, I think it's fair to say that those Southerners using the filibuster to block civil rights and voting rights certainly had the biggest effect, and we would probably say the largest harm on Americans by the consistent use of that lack of debate limits, for sure, even if the filibuster wasn't only exclusively used on behalf of racial interests.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the present day, it has become a pungent talking point about the filibuster's future, that now what the Democrats and President Biden are describing as the great civil rights bill of the moment, which is this sort of democracy governance process overhaul bill that the House has passed called H.R. 1, which has a strong voting rights component to it. It's multifaceted. It touches campaign finance and government ethics and the way congressional districts are drawn. But it is also the Democrats' principal response to nationalize voting rights at a time when Republicans in charge of state legislatures around the country are trying to pare back voting rights. So you have people like Senator Warnock, most passionately, saying, how can you have, a tool that was designed to protect the rights of the senatorial minority is in effect being used to clobber the rights of ethnic minorities in the democratic process. It's a powerful argument.
So let's talk for a minute about the arguments, because the other argument that it's now, the filibuster conversation has become very partisan, not surprisingly, as has so many things, that with the Democrats describing the filibuster as an obstruction to democracy reigning, witness House Bill 1, and the Republicans describing the filibuster as a tool to ensure that there's greater debate in the Senate and that we reach a compromise and that we don't pass legislation on a straight party line vote. Do you have comments on that particular narrative?
Well, just to echo the where you stand is where you sit comment, which is the two sides are taking those positions now because of where the power resides now. If magically, it's not going to happen for the next 4 years, but if magically, if in 4 years we have a Republican in Washington with a Republican president and a Republican majority Senate, I would imagine that some of the scripts would trade places, just as the scripts were handed back and, metaphorically, were handed back and forth between 2013 and 2017, when the two nuclear options were exercised, just as Senator McConnell, after 2017, when Donald Trump was the president and he ran the Senate, he said, I am never, ever, 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 ever going to touch the legislative filibuster. You can have my word on it. And now he takes to the Senate floor and says, you think this place doesn't work now? Wait till what happens if you end the filibuster on legislation. I think he's used words like, I'll bring the Senate to its knees, and nothing will happen. Who is in, right? The script gets handed back and forth depending on who runs the show. And sometimes you can actually go to C-SPAN, and if you really want to nerd, to be some clever TV producers, many clever TV producers, you don't even have to be too clever to go into the archives and pull out people on opposite sides saying almost the exact same thing a few years apart, and the same senator saying almost 180 degrees things differently a few years apart.
So following that theory, if Congress were to abolish the filibuster at this point, they could reinstate it because it's a rule change. They would, use your crystal ball. I don't think they probably would once they abolished it, but theoretically they could, right?
Yeah. So in 2013, when Democrats nuked, as we say, most judicial nominations, in 2014, Republicans win back control, and they did have a debate in the Republican conference about whether to reinstate, which would be to reinterpret Rule 22, to return it to supermajorities, which they could do through setting a new precedent, a new interpretation. And the senators, there are two senators whose comments stood out to me. One was Roy Blunt, who said, from Missouri, he said, it just makes sense. It's part of the traditions of the Senate. We have majority rule for nominations and supermajority for legislation, right? Like months before, they were excoriating Harry Reid for destroying the fabric of the Senate, and then all of a sudden they're in the majority, and sure, it's been absorbed into Senate tradition. But I think it was Senator Shelby who put it even better. He said, once you squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube, it's really hard to get it back in, right? So in response to your sort of really interesting question, like, well, they could reverse it if they didn't like it. Well, I think we don't know, of course, but if they were to muster a large enough majority to nuke the legislative filibuster, I'd be hard pressed to see it turn back the other way.
I think you're right. I can't imagine them turning.
I think you're right, and I also think just thinking about it in crass sort of modern political terms, it would be the country. I think might embrace it, because if suddenly, at least 51% of the country would embrace it, because a bunch of stuff would happen, and Congress wouldn't look so dysfunctional anymore. Now, when the ideological worm turned, and the other and if, let's say, it happens now in an all Democratic system, and in 4 years is an all Republican system, and suddenly the country gets whipsawed by things reversing again, I don't know whether the public would care, or whether they'd say, well, I guess that's democracy in action for you. We'll think climate change is an existential threat this year, and in 3 years we'll think it's phony science, and then 4 years later maybe we'll change our mind again. I don't know.
Well, we're coming up toward the end, so we're going to do a couple lightning rounds. One is, would they have to change the rules if they went back to a talking filibuster?
So it's a little unclear. There are some versions that would require a rule change. So Senator Merkley 10 years ago proposed one that was coupled with majority cloture. Tire everybody out, and then a majority can vote to cut off debate. But other versions are really sort of expecting a change of behavior. Let's really make Ted Cruz talk all night. Let's really make the Republicans hold the floor. And at the end of the day, we'll see which party is the one standing. And then precedent allows the presiding officer to put something to a vote if nobody seeks the floor. They don't usually do it that way, but they could. So devil's in the details.
Yeah.
But it could just be a behavioral change, not a rule change.
Right. So, and do you have any thoughts on the Biden Commission on the Supreme Court and how that might play into the filibuster? Briefly.
Oh, I think the Biden Commission on the Supreme Court. No, I mean, in part less than some other things, than some legislation, because if the Biden Commission on the Supreme Court proposes, I guess it would require, let's say the commission proposed growing the size of the court, that would happen through statute, and statute would be filibusterable. So I guess I guess it could. I think another one that we haven't talked about, though, is that in addition to what Sarah was talking about, is another idea. So President Biden has talked about making a talking filibuster, but he hasn't talked about changing the threshold at the end of the talkathon, which I think is interesting. And I think he's opposed that, maybe even. There's another one that I haven't heard so much recently, which is changing the threshold after every cloture vote. You don't quite get so in other words, you start the first time you make everybody come into the room and vote, and it takes 60. Then the next time, 59, and then then maybe 57. Or so ultimately, after 10 votes, you eventually get to a majority to end the debate. And I guess somehow that's supposed to apply political pressure on the minority, or I don't know. Is that what's supposed to happen, sir?
So I think conceptually, it gives the minority part of what they want. Is what they claim is if we had debate, we could change people's minds. Now, right. In such a partisan world, it's unusual that we get minds changing through debate on the floor.
Right.
But conceptually, at least, and because cloture is so clunky and the Senate is so slow, right, ratcheting down from 60 to 57 votes for cloture to 54 and down to 51 could take 2-3 weeks. So, and that could, gin up campaigns outside the Senate and so forth. But at the end of the day, if everybody knows that it's 51 votes for cloture, one might wonder whether it would have that intended effect.
Another thing about the turnabout is fair play, and I know we have to wind it up, is just to remind people how relatively few senators are left in today's Senate who knew things in the pre-nuclear world. There's way more turnover. I mean, in other words, the number of institutionalists, the Dan Inaways and Bob Byrds and John Warners of the world, there's a very small number of these people. The Senate has had significant turnover in the last decade, and there are not a lot of, you hear Chris Murphy and Senator Schatz joke at the Appropriations Committee about how someday in 50 years one of them is going to be chairman. I don't think it's going to take 50 years anymore. The place has high turnover. There's not a lot of people who are there who have very, very long games or very, very long political plans, and so they're willing to, if it takes blowing up the thing to get something done next year, they're willing to do it.
Well, as we go to, here's our final question, and then we're going to talk about upcoming events. And in this context, think about when you looked at that list of the Gang of 14 and the moderates, you lost the moderates in both parties. That there's something going on with regard to the primary system that is bringing more partisan people, even to the Senate, when it's a full state because of the primary system. But the question is, looking at the role the filibuster has played in sort of delaying things and creating a sense that the majority's not making a decision. How has that led to people's getting fed up with Washington and feeling like things are not working. Is that a component of this, or is that just an outcome of the partisan debate, the partisan gridlock that's coming as a result of the elections?
I'll just briefly say it's certainly the case that when moderates have left the Senate and retired or lost their races, but especially the ones who retire, have said it's not fun anymore. Nothing happens there. I mean, you hear it even from Joe Manchin, who keeps running. And that is, it's the fact of the matter is, in a 60-vote Senate, you need discussions across party lines to make things work. And the more the partisans teams each become sort of red team and blue team, and I oppose it because your team's for it, that's really hard to get people in the room to actually have an incentive to sit down to negotiate. And so in that sense, certainly partisanship is helping fuel the departure of moderates. And of course, partisanship is making it less likely that they can win in the first place.
I think I just counted 9. So 9 of the gang of 14 were replaced by people from the other side. There is, depending on who does the measurement, there is, back in these days, I mean, there was CQ where I used to work, National Journal does it a different way. Pretty easy to come up with quantitative ways of measuring ideological overlap. There is none in the Senate or the House anymore. I mean, there is no Republican to the left of any Democrat, no Democrat to the right of any Republican, not even Manchin or Sinema. I mean, it just, we're not there anymore. This would not be, and of course, I think it's pretty easy to say that would not change if the filibuster ended. It would just be more. It would be just my way for 2 years, and then the other, the blue way for 2 years, and then maybe the red way for 2 years.
Well, my friends,
How optimistic is that?
We appreciate your historical views, your perspective on being on the floor. And it is really important to sort of bring this factual perspective, because there's so much noise in the network about who said what to who and what really happened, that Sarah, for you, taking us back to Aaron Burr, and David, you showing us what went on the floor in different settings. It is really informative, it's important, and it is the work of the Historical Society. So we appreciate both of you providing your time and your talent to make us smarter today, give us more information. As we always do, these are recorded. They will be available on our website within a few weeks as we get them edited. And we just edit the front and back end, so that it'll all be here. And as we look forward, we want to make sure that we invite you to the upcoming events. Next week, we return to our continuing series Toward a More Perfect Union, looking at the continuing struggle that we've gone through in this country to meet the values of equality and justice set forth by our founding fathers. Yes, they were all fathers. They were all men. They were all white. Some of them owned people and thought that was okay. But even with all that, they wrote documents that talked about inclusion. And so we've been talking about how we have worked toward that. And next week, we will be talking about economic equality and access to capital with, again, a scholar, Dr. Jessica Gordon-Newhart from John Jay College, and a practitioner, Shay Hawkings, who worked with Senator Scott from South Carolina to create the Opportunity Zone program as a way to bring capital into underserved communities. The following Tuesday, we return to our lunch bites with our ever wonderful Steve Livengood, talking about the Cox corridors, round 2, to tell you what's that treasure. And then our next in our More Perfect Union series is looking at immigration in the 18th and 19th centuries with Dr. Alan Kraut from American University. We hope you'll join us for these, and we want to thank you, as always. These These webinars and all the work of the Society is only available because of the donations that come from our members and our supporters. So this is the commercial. Don't forget to make your contributions. Also, one of the ways we support ourselves is with our merchandise. You too can have one of these We the People mugs, or any of our fine ornaments and bookends made from marble from the Capitol. We appreciate your being with us. Thank you, David Hawkings. Thank you, Sarah Binder. We are honored to have had you today. And thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you, Jane.
Great, thank you.